Frostbite claims the extremities first, but betrayal freezes the heart instantly. At 35 degrees below zero, human breath shatters like glass in the air. Beatrice Gallagher knew this as she dragged her frail 68-year-old mother Ruth through waist-deep snow, cast out of their own family cabin by those they trusted most. They were condemned to die in the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. Yet, 48 hours later, when search and rescue finally breached the silent, frozen ridge, the tragedy uncovered was not the one anyone expected. The outcasts in the ice cave were breathing. The warm, secure cabin was a tomb. Blackwood Ridge sat perched on the jagged teeth of the Alaskan wilderness, a place where geography was destiny and the weather was a merciless god. For Beatrice Gallagher, the ridge had once been a sanctuary. It was where she and her late husband, David, had built their life, carving out a homestead of heavy timber and river stone. But David had been dead for barely 3 months, taken by a sudden, massive coronary event that left Beatrice reeling in a vacuum of grief. She was 34, a widow, and the sole caretaker of her mother, Ruth Higgins. Ruth suffered from the cruel, creeping fog of early-stage Alzheimer's, a condition that made the familiar suddenly terrifying and the terrifying completely incomprehensible. The winter of 2024 was already slated to be historically brutal, but meteorologists had grossly underestimated the ferocity of the polar vortex sweeping down from the Arctic Circle. By mid-January, the ambient temperature on Blackwood Ridge hovered around 20 below zero, with wind chills plunging into the negative 50s. It was the kind of cold that crystallized the fluid in a person's eyes and snapped exposed pine branches like dry twigs. Beatrice and Ruth were prepared to wait out the storm. The cabin was well insulated, stocked with canned goods, dried venison, and cords of seasoned oak. What Beatrice was not prepared for was the unexpected arrival of David's older brother, Thomas Gallagher, and his wife, Sylvia. They arrived 2 days before the absolute worst of the vortex hit, their heavy SUV tearing up the snow-packed driveway. Thomas had always been a man composed of sharp angles and simmering resentments. He was a regional manager for a logistics firm in Seattle, a man who measured worth in profit margins and viewed his younger brother's rustic lifestyle with thinly veiled contempt. Sylvia was a real estate agent with a penchant for designer winter wear that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of the rugged wilderness. "We came to check on you, Bea," Thomas had announced, shaking the snow from his expensive boots in the mudroom. His eyes, however, were not entirely focused on her. They darted around the cabin, appraising the heavy oak beams, the stone fireplace, and the sweeping, panoramic views of the frozen valley below. And to discuss the estate, David left things in a mess. Beatrice had felt the first cold knot of dread form in her stomach. "The estate is settled, Thomas. David left the cabin to me. We filed the paperwork in Anchorage 2 years ago." Sylvia unbuttoned her fur-lined parka, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, honey, you know how these legal things are. Thomas's lawyers found a discrepancy with the original land deed. The property was technically in their father's trust first. We just want to make sure everything is equitable, especially now that you're burdened with your mother's care." The sheer audacity of the ambush left Beatrice speechless. They hadn't come for a welfare check. They had come to lay claim. But before the argument could escalate into a full-blown legal battle in the living room, the atmosphere outside shifted violently. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum. The wind, which had been a steady howl, escalated into a deafening roar that shook the heavy timbers of the cabin. Within hours, the storm hit with apocalyptic fury. The temperature plummeted to 35 degrees below zero. The power lines down the mountain snapped under the weight of an inch of solid ice, plunging the entire ridge into darkness. Thomas, ever the man who needed to be in control, immediately took charge. He had brought a massive, commercial-grade portable diesel generator in the back of his SUV. "I knew the grid out here was garbage," he muttered, directing Beatrice to help him haul the heavy machinery. "Where are we putting it?" Beatrice shouted over the roar of the wind, her breath pluming in thick white clouds. It needs to go in the open-air shed. Are you insane? Thomas snapped, his face red from the biting cold. It's 35 below out there. The fuel lines will gel, and the engine block will crack. We're putting it in the attached utility room. It's got a window I can crack for exhaust. Beatrice hesitated. David always said never to run combustion engines inside. Even with a window open, the draft can push the exhaust back into the house. David is dead, Beatrice, Thomas said cruelly, the words slicing through the frigid air like a scalpel. And I am the one keeping us from freezing to death. Grab the other handle. Reluctantly, Beatrice helped him wrestle the generator into the utility room connected to the kitchen. When the machine roared to life, the lights flickered back on, and the electric baseboard heaters began to hum. But the dynamic in the house had irrevocably changed. Thomas had established himself as the savior and the gatekeeper of their survival. He controlled the power, the thermostat, and, increasingly, the narrative of who belonged in the cabin. As the days dragged on and the storm outside intensified, sealing them in behind snowdrifts that reached the second-story windows, the cabin fever began to set in. The air inside grew thick and tense, and the true nightmare was only just beginning. By the fourth day of the whiteout, the temperature holding steady at a lethal -35 degrees Fahrenheit, the psychological walls of the cabin began to close in. The humming of the diesel generator in the utility room was a constant, maddening drone. Thomas had cracked the small window and haphazardly taped a piece of corrugated aluminum to act as a makeshift exhaust pipe. But the house still smelled faintly of diesel and burnt oil. Sylvia spent her days huddled by the fireplace, wrapped in Beatrice's grandmother's Afghan, complaining incessantly about the draft, the lack of internet, and the smell of the venison stew Beatrice kept simmering on the wood stove. The real friction, however, centered around Ruth. The change in routine, the violent weather, and the hostile presence of strangers severely agitated the older woman. Ruth's mind, untethered from the present, began to drift back to decades past. She would wander the cabin at all hours, turning on faucets, opening the front door to let the dog out, a dog that had died in 1998, and letting blasts of lethal Arctic air into the living room. Each time, Thomas's temper flared hotter. "Control your mother, Beatrice," he yelled after Ruth accidentally knocked over a precious lantern, shattering the glass and spilling kerosene across the rug. "We are in a survival situation, and she is a liability. She's wasting our heat, she's wasting our food, and she's driving me out of my mind. This is her home, Thomas." Beatrice fired back, kneeling on the floor to scrub the harsh-smelling fuel from the fibers. "She's sick. She doesn't understand." "What I understand," Sylvia chimed in from the couch, her voice dripping with poison, "is that this cabin cannot sustain 4 people. Not with the generator guzzling fuel. We brought enough diesel to last a week, maybe less at this rate. And Thomas and I have jobs, responsibilities, lives to get back to. We can't afford to freeze to death because an old woman keeps opening the windows." The paranoia was palpable. Thomas and Sylvia had convinced themselves that resources were running out, despite Beatrice's assurances that the pantry was full. Their greed for the property had mutated, under the pressure of the storm, into a primal, irrational survivalism. They began hoarding the canned goods in their bedroom. They locked the thermostat. They treated Beatrice and Ruth not as family, but as parasites. The breaking point occurred on the evening of the 5th day. Ruth, confused and looking for a bathroom in the dark, wandered into the utility room. Disoriented by the deafening noise of the generator, she tripped over the power cord, yanking it from the socket and sending the house into abrupt, pitch-black silence. In her panic, she flailed, knocking a heavy wrench off a workbench. It struck the generator's fuel valve, cracking the plastic housing. A slow, steady drip of precious diesel began to pool on the concrete floor. When Thomas discovered the damage 10 minutes later, his rage was absolute and terrifying. "That's it!" he roared, shoving Beatrice aside as she tried to inspect the damage. He grabbed a roll of duct tape, frantically trying to stem the leak. She broke the valve. We're losing fuel. Because of that senile old bat. We are all going to freeze to death. It was an accident. I can fix it, Thomas. Just let me look, Beatrice pleaded. Sylvia appeared in the doorway, holding a heavy Maglite flashlight, casting eerie, bouncing shadows against the walls. No, Beatrice. Thomas is right. We are done compromising. Thomas stood up. His face twisted in a mask of ugly, desperate resolve. The nearest neighbour, with a landline and a working snowcat, is the Henderson place. 3 miles down the logging road, Beatrice stared at him, uncomprehending. Henderson? No one can make it 3 miles in this. It's 35 below zero. The wind chill is -60. It's a death sentence, to even step off the porch. Then you better bundle up, Thomas said coldly. The gravity of his words hung in the frigid air. Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. You're kicking us out? You're throwing my mother out into a blizzard? I'm sending you for help, Thomas corrected, though the lie was transparent. You know the terrain better than we do. You take your mother, you walk to Henderson's, and you send a rescue crew back for us. If she stays here, she's going to get us all killed. I won't allow it. No, Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I am not leaving my house, and I am not taking my mother into that. What followed was a blur of violence. Thomas, larger and fueled by adrenaline and panic, grabbed Beatrice by the collar of her heavy flannel shirt, hurling her backward into the kitchen counter. Sylvia, shedding her refined persona entirely, grabbed Ruth by the arm, dragging the weeping, confused old woman toward the front door. Get your coats, get your boots. You're leaving, Sylvia shrieked. Beatrice scrambled to her feet, lunging at Thomas, but he caught her by the shoulders and shoved her violently toward the mudroom. Realizing she could not physically overpower him, and seeing Sylvia roughly shoving her mother out the open front door into the howling, blinding snow, Beatrice's survival instinct kicked in. She had seconds to prepare. She snatched her extreme weather parka from the hook, shoved her feet into her insulated boots, and grabbed Ruth's heavy down coat and mittens. She snagged a small, foil-wrapped emergency blanket and a heavy-duty flashlight from the console table before Thomas forcefully pushed her over the threshold. Bring back a snowcat, Thomas yelled over the roaring wind. The heavy oak door slammed shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sickening, final thud. Beatrice pounded her fists against the wood, screaming until her throat felt raw, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the shrieking gale. She turned. Ruth was huddled on the snow-covered porch, shivering violently, wearing only her slippers, a thin cardigan, and pajama pants. The temperature gauge mounted on the window casing read -36 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold hit Beatrice's exposed cheeks like a spray of shattered glass. They were outside. They were alone, and they had minutes before their blood began to freeze. The cold at 35 degrees below zero is not merely a temperature. It is a physical entity, a predator that immediately begins dismantling the human body's defenses. Within 30 seconds of being locked out, the moisture inside Beatrice's nostrils froze solid. Her eyelashes clumped with ice from her own ragged breath. Mom! Mom! Look at me! Beatrice screamed, dropping to her knees on the porch. She forced Ruth's arms into the heavy down coat, zipping it up to the older woman's chin, and shoved the thick mittens onto her trembling hands. She wrapped the thin foil emergency blanket around Ruth's legs, tying it awkwardly with the belt of her own parka. David? Ruth whimpered, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form the word. Where is David? It's cold, Bea. Let's go inside. We can't go inside, Mom. We have to walk. We have to go for a walk right now. Beatrice looked down the driveway. The logging road that led to the Henderson place was completely obliterated by a 4-foot drift of snow. To attempt a 3-mile hike in waist-deep powder, in the dark, with a frail senior citizen, was mathematically impossible. They wouldn't make it a quarter of a mile before collapsing from exhaustion and hypothermia. Thomas knew this. Sylvia knew this. It was a murder, cleverly disguised as a desperate plea for rescue. Beatrice's mind raced, scrolling through the geography of Blackwood Ridge. She needed shelter, and she needed it immediately. The outbuildings were locked, Thomas having secured the padlocks days ago to protect the supplies. Then, a memory pierced through her panic. 2 summers ago, David had taken her foraging for wild mushrooms near the eastern edge of their property line, roughly 300 yards behind the cabin. The terrain there dropped off sharply into a ravine. Cut deep into the bedrock of that ravine was a geological anomaly, a natural limestone cave, carved out by an ancient, long-dried underground river. David had called it the Bear's Den, though no animals inhabited it because the entrance was choked with thorny scrub brush. The cave was deep, extending perhaps 40 feet into the earth, and more importantly, the ambient temperature deep underground, below the frost line, hovered naturally around 45 degrees. Compared to -35, 45 degrees was a tropical paradise. "We aren't going to Henderson's," Beatrice said, grabbing Ruth by the shoulders. "We're going to the ravine. You have to walk, Mom. You have to force your legs to move." Beatrice dragged a plastic utility sled, normally used for hauling firewood, from under the snow-covered porch. She maneuvered Ruth onto the flat piece of plastic, instructing her to tuck her knees to her chest. "Hold on, Mum, please, just hold on." Beatrice grabbed the tow rope, looped it over her shoulder, and stepped off the porch into the abyssal whiteout. The snow was thigh-deep. Every step required Beatrice to lift her leg agonizingly high, push forward, and drag the weight of the sled behind her. The wind shrieked like a banshee, driving microscopic ice crystals into the exposed sliver of skin between her goggles and her scarf. The pain was excruciating, a burning sensation that felt as though her face was being held against a hot iron. 10 yards. 20 yards. The cabin behind them vanished entirely, swallowed by the swirling vortex of white. They were completely unmoored in a sea of darkness and ice. Beatrice navigated by memory and the subtle slope of the terrain, moving perpendicular to the brutal wind. Her lungs burned with every inhalation of the sub-zero air. The muscles in her thighs screamed in protest. Behind her, Ruth had gone terrifyingly silent. The shivering had stopped, a clinical sign of stage 2 hypothermia, where the body's core temperature drops so low it abandons the mechanism of shivering to conserve whatever microscopic energy is left for the heart and brain. "Stay with me!" Beatrice gasped, though she couldn't hear her own voice. After what felt like hours, but could only have been 20 minutes, the ground beneath the snow began to pitch sharply downward. The tree line thickened, breaking the brunt of the wind. Beatrice stumbled, falling forward into a drift as the sled slid past her. She scrambled up, shining the heavy maglite into the dark. There it was. A jagged, black fissure in the snow-caked rock face. The entrance to the limestone cave. It was partially blocked by a massive drift, but Beatrice threw herself at it, digging like a wild animal with her bare, mittened hands. She cleared a path just wide enough, grabbed the sled's rope, and hauled her mother into the dark opening. The immediate cessation of the wind was shocking. The silence inside the stone walls rang in Beatrice's ears. She dragged the sled deeper, moving 20, then 30 feet into the narrow, winding throat of the cave, until the floor leveled out into a small, dry cavern. She turned the flashlight on. The beam illuminated damp limestone walls and a ceiling adorned with tiny stalactites, but the most crucial element was the air. It was cold, bitterly cold, but it lacked the lethal, kinetic bite of the wind chill above. It was stagnant, earthy, and infinitely survivable. Beatrice fell to her knees beside the sled. She unzipped her own parka and wrapped it around Ruth, pressing her own body against her mother's frail frame to share body heat. "We're safe, Mom. We're out of the wind." Ruth did not respond. Her lips were a frightening shade of blue, her eyes half closed and glassy. Beatrice knew that simply escaping the wind wasn't enough. They were sitting in a 40-degree stone refrigerator in damp clothes. They needed a heat source, or they would simply die slower than they would have on the surface. She began to pat down her pockets, praying she had left something, anything, in the coat from her last trip to town. Her stiff, numb fingers brushed against a hard plastic rectangle in her left pocket. A heavy-duty butane storm lighter. She had used it a week ago to thaw a frozen padlock on the woodshed and shoved it in her pocket. Beatrice practically sobbed with relief. She scrambled around the floor of the cave. Being underground, there was no snow, but there was a layer of ancient, bone-dry debris that had blown in over the decades, dead pine needles, dried leaves, and brittle twigs. It wasn't much, but it was tinder. With trembling, near-useless hands, she piled the debris into a small mound. It took 6 agonizing attempts to spark the lighter, her thumb lacking the dexterity to push the ignition. On the 7th try, a blue-yellow flame erupted. She touched it to the dry pine needles. The pile caught, a small, fragile blossom of orange light and heat illuminating the dark walls of their limestone tomb. Beatrice dragged Ruth closer to the tiny fire, continuously rubbing her mother's arms and legs. "Look at the fire, Mom. We're going to make it. We are going to survive this." Above them, on the ridge, the storm raged on, burying the cabin under feet of snow. But as Beatrice fed small twigs to the flame, a grim, terrifying thought crossed her mind. Thomas and Sylvia were warm inside the heavily insulated cabin. They had food, they had beds, and they had the generator. Beatrice and Ruth were huddled in the dirt. Yet, as she sat in the dark, watching the smoke from their tiny fire drift toward the ceiling and get sucked out by a natural draft in the cavern's roof, Beatrice thought about the utility room. She thought about Thomas's refusal to put the generator outside. She thought about the heavy snow piling up against the side of the house, burying the windows, sealing the cracks, and suffocating the makeshift exhaust vent Thomas had built. Beatrice pulled her mother tighter against her chest as the long, dark night began. She didn't know it yet, but the very fortress Thomas had violently claimed for himself was quietly turning into a gas chamber. Time in the limestone fissure did not pass in hours or minutes. It was measured by the agonizingly slow burn of dead twigs and the terrifyingly shallow rise and fall of Ruth's chest. The temperature inside the cavern held at a stagnant 42 degrees. To a body already plunged into the early stages of hypothermia, it was merely a slower executioner than the negative 35-degree vortex screaming above them. Beatrice crouched over the pathetic, flickering flame. The dry debris she had scavenged was burning up too fast. She needed denser fuel. Carefully, she unzipped her heavy parka and pulled off her inner flannel layer, shivering violently as the damp chill of the cave kissed her sweat-soaked skin. She used her pocket knife to shred the thick cotton fabric, feeding the strips into the fire. The flame flared, casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the stalactites. "Bay?" The voice was thin, reedy, and astonishingly clear. Beatrice whipped her head around. Ruth was staring at her. The glassy, vacant sheen of Alzheimer's temporarily banished by the sheer, primal shock to her nervous system. It was a phenomenon her neurologist in Seattle, Dr. Harrison Miller, had once mentioned. A surge of adrenaline and cortisol could sometimes briefly bridge the broken neural pathways in a dementia patient's brain. "Mom, I'm here. I'm right here." Beatrice crawled over, pressing her hands against her mother's pale cheeks. They were cold, like marble left out in the winter rain. "Why are we in the dark?" Ruth whispered, her brow furrowing not in confusion, but in acute pain. "My legs hurt, Bea. They feel like they're burning." It was a terrible paradox. As frostnip deepened into frostbite, the dying nerves sent phantom signals of intense, burning heat to the brain. "I know, Mum. I know. We had to leave the cabin. The storm. Beatrice couldn't bring herself to explain the betrayal. To tell a mother she had been thrown out to die by her own son-in-law was a cruelty Beatrice refused to inflict. Ruth looked past Beatrice, staring at the small, smoky fire. "David's cave," she murmured softly. "He told me he found a place where the earth breathes." Beatrice choked back a sob. Yes, yes, this is David's cave. You just have to hold on, Mum. When the sun comes up, the storm will break. I'll go get help. I promise." But as the hours bled into one another, the reality of their situation clamped down like a vice. The flannel was gone. The dry debris was gone. The fire finally sputtered, coughed a plume of acrid white smoke, and died. Complete, suffocating darkness instantly flooded the cavern. Without the psychological anchor of the light, the cold became an aggressive, physical weight. Beatrice wrapped her arms tightly around her mother, pulling the foil emergency blanket over both of their heads to trap whatever radiant heat their bodies still possessed. They lay together on the hard, unyielding limestone, a tangle of shivering limbs. In the pitch black, Beatrice's mind began to play tricks on her. She heard the phantom hum of the diesel generator. She smelled the rich, savory scent of the venison stew she had left on the wood stove. She imagined the heavy woolen blankets in her bedroom. The temptation to close her eyes and simply drift away on those warm thoughts was overwhelming. Hypothermia is a gentle killer in its final stages. It wraps its victim in a blanket of profound lethargy, convincing the brain that sleep is the only logical solution. "No," Beatrice thought, viciously biting her own lip until the sharp, metallic tang of blood flooded her mouth. The pain snapped her awake. "I will not let her die in the dirt." She began to rhythmically massage Ruth's arms and legs, forcing friction, forcing movement, acting as a human heart pumping warmth into a failing body. Above them, the wind continued its slaughter of the landscape. But less than 300 yards away, an entirely different, silent massacre was unfolding. Inside the Gallagher cabin, the temperature was a balmy 72 degrees. The electric baseboard heaters, powered by the massive diesel generator in the utility room, clicked and hummed, maintaining a perfect, artificial oasis against the apocalyptic freeze outside. At 2 a.m., Thomas Gallagher woke up with a sensation of immense pressure behind his eyes. It felt as though a steel band was tightening around his skull. He groaned, rolling over in the heavy, plush bed he had commandeered from Beatrice. His mouth was parched, and a wave of severe nausea rolled through his stomach. "Sylvia," he muttered, nudging his wife. "Sylvia, get up. I think I've got food poisoning. That damn stew." Sylvia didn't move. She lay on her back, her breathing shallow and unnaturally fast. Thomas sat up, the room spinning violently. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his feet hitting the warm pine floorboards. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like they were made of wet sand. He collapsed onto his knees, his heart hammering erratically in his chest. Panic, thick and primal, finally pierced his arrogance. He crawled toward the bedroom door, his vision swimming. The hallway was dimly lit by a single nightlight, but the air felt impossibly heavy. Outside, the snow had done exactly what Beatrice had feared. The relentless, driving blizzard had banked massive drifts against the side of the cabin, burying the foundation and creeping up the exterior walls. The small window in the utility room, which Thomas had cracked open and fitted with a makeshift aluminum exhaust pipe, had been completely engulfed by a 6-foot wall of packed snow and ice. The diesel generator, a beast of combustion, required massive amounts of oxygen to run, and in its wake, it produced lethal volumes of carbon monoxide. With the exhaust pipe blocked by the snowdrift, the deadly gas had nowhere to go. It hit the wall of snow and was pushed violently backward, flooding into the utility room and seeping under the door frames into the airtight cabin. Carbon monoxide is the perfect assassin. It is completely odorless, tasteless, and invisible. It binds to the hemoglobin in the blood with a grim efficiency, starving the brain and organs of oxygen while leaving the victim entirely unaware of their suffocation. Thomas reached the living room, dragging himself across the woven rug. His mind was misfiring, logical thought replaced by a heavy, drunken confusion. He saw the front door. He remembered locking it. He remembered the satisfying click of the deadbolt as he sealed Beatrice and Ruth outside. "Need air," his brain sluggishly demanded. "Open the door." He reached a trembling hand up toward the brass knob. He was less than 3 feet from salvation. But the carbon monoxide concentration in the cabin had already surpassed 800 parts per million. At that level, a healthy adult will lose consciousness in less than an hour. Thomas had been breathing it in for 4. His fingers brushed the cold metal of the doorknob. Then, the last of the oxygen was starved from his frontal lobe. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed heavily onto the floor, his face resting against the very threshold he had forbidden his sister-in-law to cross. In the utility room, the generator finally consumed the last of its oxygen. The engine sputtered, choked on its own toxic exhaust, and died, plunging the cabin into abrupt, deadly silence. The heaters clicked off. The lights vanished. The cabin was secure. The doors were locked. The windows were sealed tight. Thomas and Sylvia Gallagher were perfectly safe from the freezing cold, entombed within the fortress they had stolen. The human body is a marvel of biological engineering, but it operates within a mercilessly narrow thermal window. When the core temperature drops below 90 degrees, the electrical impulses of the heart become erratic. The brain, starved of warm, oxygenated blood, begins to misfire, inducing a profound and dangerous apathy. Deep inside the limestone fissure of the bear's den, Beatrice Gallagher was fighting a losing war against thermodynamics. The absolute darkness of the cavern amplified every sound, the erratic, shallow rasp of Ruth's breathing and the frantic, terrifying hammering of Beatrice's own heart. She had abandoned all pretense of preserving her own body heat. She lay draped over her mother, pressing her core against Ruth's chest, wrapping her arms around the older woman's frail shoulders under the foil blanket. Time ceased to exist as a linear concept. It became a cyclical nightmare of checking Ruth's pulse, which felt weak and thready beneath the icy skin of her wrist, and aggressively massaging her mother's limbs. "Don't go to sleep, Mum. Talk to me," Beatrice pleaded into the dark, her voice hoarse and broken. Silence answered her. Ruth had slipped past the point of delirium into a state of profound, terrifying stupor. Desperation breeds ingenuity, but it also strips away the final layers of human dignity. Beatrice realized that the dampness of their clothes, soaked from the snow during their forced march, was accelerating the heat loss. With numb, clumsy fingers, she unzipped Ruth's heavy coat and her own parka. She pressed her bare skin directly against her mother's chest, acting as a human incubator. The shock of the freezing skin against hers made Beatrice gasp, her muscles cramping violently in protest. But she held tight. She focused her mind on Dr. Harrison Miller's clinical explanations, using them as a mental anchor. Core temperature maintenance. Prevent ventricular fibrillation. Do not allow the victim to fall asleep. "I'm going to tell you about the garden, Mum," Beatrice whispered through violently chattering teeth. "I'm going to tell you about the heirloom tomatoes we're planting this spring, the Cherokee purples. You love those." She talked for hours to the pitch-black void, reciting recipes, recalling childhood vacations to the Oregon coast, and recounting the meticulous details of David's carpentry projects. She talked until her throat bled, and her voice was reduced to a raw, painful croak. Sometime during the deepest abyss of the night, the profound, structural vibration that had been rattling the very bedrock of the ridge began to fade. Beatrice stopped talking. She held her breath, straining to listen. The shrieking howl of the polar vortex, a sound that had been a constant, deafening companion for 5 days, was subsiding. The banshee wail dropped to a low moan. And then, miraculously, reduced to a hollow, whistling breeze. Beatrice carefully lifted her head from the foil blanket. She looked toward the narrow throat of the cave. A faint, bruised purple luminescence was bleeding through the snowpack that choked the entrance. Dawn. The storm had broken. The high-pressure system that had driven the vortex was finally pushing eastward. Beatrice carefully untangled herself from her mother. Her own joints screamed in agony. Her fingers were stiff, wooden claws, the skin a pale, waxy yellow, the undeniable hallmark of deep frostbite. She zipped Ruth's coat back up, tucking the emergency blanket tightly around the older woman's motionless form. "Mom," Beatrice said, gently shaking her shoulder. Ruth's eyelids fluttered, a microscopic movement, but enough to confirm she was still clinging to life. The wind stopped. "I have to go now. I have to leave you here to get help. Do not move. I will be back." Crawling on her hands and knees, Beatrice navigated the narrow tunnel toward the light. She clawed at the snowdrift blocking the entrance, her frozen fingers tearing at the packed ice until she broke through to the surface. The light was blinding. The sky was an impossible, crystalline blue, scrubbed clean by the violence of the blizzard. But the beauty of the morning was a deceptive trap. The ambient temperature was still hovering at 28 degrees below zero. The air was perfectly still, but it was heavy and sharp, freezing the moisture in Beatrice's lungs with every ragged inhalation. She hauled herself out of the cave and stood up on trembling legs. The landscape was unrecognizable. Blackwood Ridge had been transformed into an alien, undulating desert of white. The familiar landmarks, the massive Douglas firs, the property line fences were either buried or snapped in half. She looked back toward her own property. The roof of the cabin was barely visible above a monolithic snowdrift. No smoke rose from the stone chimney. No exhaust plumed from the utility room. The house sat dead and silent in the frozen wasteland. Beatrice turned her back on her home. She locked her eyes on the distant tree line where she knew the logging road lay. 3 miles. Under normal conditions, a brisk hour's walk. In waist-deep powder, with muscles cannibalizing themselves for energy and frostbite chewing at her extremities, it was an impossible marathon. She took her first agonizing step into the powder. She had to reach the Hendersons. Arthur Henderson was 72 years old, a retired structural engineer who had moved to the Alaskan interior 3 decades ago for the isolation and the challenge. He and his wife, Martha, were seasoned veterans of the bush. They respected the cold, prepared for it meticulously, and understood that out here, a minor mistake was a death sentence. At 8:15 a.m., Arthur was on his enclosed back porch, methodically scraping the thick layer of rime ice from the glass to assess the storm's aftermath. His massive wood stove was roaring, keeping their homestead at a comfortable 65 degrees. Through a cleared patch of glass, his eyes scanned the tree line at the edge of his property. The pristine, unbroken expanse of the snowfield was marred by a dark, sluggish shape. Arthur grabbed his binoculars from the windowsill. He adjusted the focus, his breath catching in his throat. It was a person. Or rather, the ragged, desperate remains of one. Beatrice Gallagher was no longer walking. The sheer physical exhaustion of dragging herself through 4 feet of snow had broken her body completely. She was army crawling, using her forearms to carve a trench through the powder, dragging her useless, frozen legs behind her. She would move forward 3 feet, collapse face down into the snow for 30 seconds, and then heave herself forward again. "Martha!" Arthur bellowed, dropping the binoculars and sprinting for the mudroom. "Get the trauma kit and the heavy blankets. Somebody's in the yard." Arthur shoved his feet into his boots, didn't bother with a coat, and threw open the front door. The sub-zero air hit him like a physical blow, but he ignored it, plunging into the deep snow, churning his legs like pistons toward the collapsed figure. When he reached her, Beatrice was face down, her breathing a horrifying, wet rattle. Her hood had fallen back, exposing her face to the brutal air. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her cheeks mottled with the grey-white patches of severe, late-stage frostbite. Arthur grabbed her by the shoulders and hoisted her up. She weighed nothing. "Hold on, girl. I've got you, Arthur grunted, lifting her entirely out of the snow. He recognized her instantly. Beatrice? My God, Bay. What happened? Beatrice's eyes rolled open. They were bloodshot and unfocused. Her jaw moved, but her vocal cords were so frozen and damaged that only a harsh, breathless whisper emerged. Mum. Cave. The ravine. Arthur didn't waste time asking questions. He hauled her the final 50 yards to his porch, kicking the door shut behind them. Martha was already waiting, spreading heavy woolen blankets on the floor near the wood stove. Call Matsu Rescue, Arthur ordered, laying Beatrice down gently. Tell them we have a critical hypothermia victim. And there's another one out in the elements. We need a medevac chopper. And we need it 10 minutes ago. Martha sprinted for the ham radio setup in the corner of the living room, the only reliable form of communication when the landlines snapped and the cell towers froze. Arthur knelt beside Beatrice. He knew better than to rub her frozen limbs or put her directly against the hot stove, which would cause lethal tissue damage and shock. He carefully began cutting her frozen, rigid clothes away with trauma shears, replacing them with warm, dry blankets. "Bee, listen to me," Arthur said, his voice steady and commanding. "Martha is getting the rescue boys on the horn. You need to tell me exactly where Ruth is." Beatrice coughed, a terrible, hacking sound that brought up a speck of blood. "David's cave. Behind our cabin. The limestone fissure. She's in the dark." Arthur's face hardened. He knew the geography of the Gallagher property. "How long has she been out there, Bee? When did the generator fail?" Beatrice grabbed Arthur's wrist with a grip that possessed terrifying, desperate strength. Her eyes locked onto his, burning with a mix of fury and profound trauma. "The generator didn't fail." "Arthur," she rasped, tears of pain finally spilling over her frozen cheeks. "Thomas kicked us out. He locked the door. He threw my mother into the blizzard." Arthur Henderson froze. The shears slipped from his hand, clattering against the wooden floorboards. In his 30 years in the brutal Alaskan bush, he had seen nature kill in countless, terrible ways. But he had never encountered this specific brand of cold-blooded human evil. Across the room, the ham radio crackled to life. "Matsu Valley Search and Rescue. This is dispatch. We copy your emergency, Henderson Homestead. Be advised. Airspace is still heavily restricted due to lingering low-pressure turbulence. Choppers are grounded. We are dispatching a specialized ground response snowcat unit from Talkeetna, but ETA is minimum 2 hours." Martha turned to her husband, her face pale. 2 hours. Art. The old woman won't last 2 hours in a cave. Arthur looked down at Beatrice, then stood up, his jaw set in a grim, immovable line. He walked to the heavy gun safe in the corner of the room, dialing the combination. "Tell dispatch to meet me at the Gallagher property," Arthur said quietly, pulling out a heavy, scoped hunting rifle and a box of ammunition. "I'm taking the snowmobile. I'm going to get Ruth." "Art, the powder is too deep. You'll flip the sled," Martha pleaded. "I'll ride the ridgeline where the wind scoured the rock bare," Arthur replied, pulling on his extreme weather gear. He grabbed a heavy thermos of hot tea and a thermal sleeping bag. He looked back at Beatrice. "I'm going to get your mother, Bee, and then I'm going to have a long talk with your brother-in-law." Arthur didn't know that the man he was preparing to confront was already dead, and that the rescue mission was about to turn into the most baffling crime scene Matsu Valley had ever seen. Arthur Henderson rode the high ridge line, where the brutal winds of the polar vortex had scoured the granite clear of the deepest snowdrifts. The customized Polaris snowmobile roared beneath him, its treads biting into the sheer ice. The wind chill biting at his exposed face was agonizing, but Arthur's mind was fixated on a singular, burning objective: the limestone fissure behind the Gallagher property. When he reached the perimeter of the homestead, the sheer scale of the snow accumulation was staggering. The Gallagher cabin, a sprawling, 2-story timber structure, was nearly swallowed by a continuous wave of white, Only the steep pitch of the metal roof and the top of the stone chimney breached the surface. But Arthur didn't look toward the house. He banked the snowmobile sharply eastward, toward the ravine. He found the entrance to the cave exactly where Beatrice had described it, a jagged, dark hole in a massive drift, bearing the frantic, bloody claw marks of Beatrice's escape. Arthur killed the engine, grabbed the heavy thermal sleeping bag and the trauma kit, and plunged into the dark. "Ruth!" Arthur barked, the beam of his heavy, tactical flashlight sweeping the damp, claustrophobic walls of the cave. "Ruth Gallagher, call out!" Silence answered him, save for the faint drip of condensation. He scrambled deeper into the cavern, his boots slipping on the loose rock. Then, the beam caught the dull, metallic glint of the foil emergency blanket. Arthur dropped to his knees. Ruth was curled into a tight fetal position on the dirt floor. Her skin was a terrifying, translucent shade of grey. Her lips pulled back from her teeth in a rictus of profound cold. Arthur stripped off his heavy gloves and pressed his 2 fingers hard against the carotid artery in her neck. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was nothing. Then, a microscopic, thready flutter. A heartbeat. "Tough old bird," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of relief and dread. She was deep into stage 3 hypothermia. Her body was shutting down its organs one by one to keep the brainstem firing. He didn't try to wake her. Moving a patient in profound hypothermia required extreme caution. A sudden jolt could throw her freezing heart into lethal ventricular fibrillation. Arthur carefully unrolled a thermal sleeping bag, laying it flat. He gently shifted Ruth's rigid body into the center, packing chemical heat warmers around her torso, never directly on the skin, but over her clothes to slowly warm her core without shocking her extremities. He zipped the bag tightly to her chin and hoisted her into his arms. Arthur carried her out of the earth and strapped the sleeping bag securely into the rescue sled towed behind his Polaris. He checked her pulse one last time. It was still there. "Hang on, Ruth," he muttered. Before he mounted the snowmobile for the return trip, Arthur turned his gaze toward the cabin. He had a promise to keep to Beatrice. He was going to have a conversation with Thomas Gallagher. He trudged through the waist-deep powder, his heavy boots carving a trench toward the front porch. The eerie silence of the property began to gnaw at his instincts. A man who had viciously kicked his family out into a blizzard to save his own resources should be awake, burning through the firewood he had stolen, running the generator he had prioritized over human life. But there was no vibration, no exhaust plume. The chimney was dead and cold. Arthur reached the front porch, sweeping the snow away from the heavy oak door. He pounded his fist against the wood. "Thomas! It's Arthur Henderson! Open the door!" Nothing. Arthur stepped back, analyzing the exterior. That was when he saw it. The massive drift banked against the utility room wall on the eastern elevation. The snow was packed solid, completely sealing the small ventilation window Beatrice had mentioned. A cold knot of realization, colder than the Alaskan air, formed in Arthur's gut. As a former structural engineer, he knew the fatal mathematics of internal combustion and unventilated spaces. He didn't bother knocking again. Arthur unslung the heavy hunting rifle from his shoulder. He aimed the butt of the heavy synthetic stock at the glass pane nearest the deadbolt and swung with all his might. The triple-paned thermal glass shattered. Arthur reached his gloved hand through the jagged hole, found the deadbolt, and twisted it. He threw his shoulder against the oak, forcing it open against a drift that had formed inside the mudroom. The air that hit him was not the freezing bite of the outdoors, nor was it the crisp warmth of a wood fire. It was heavy, stale, and unnaturally warm, a stagnant 70 degrees. And beneath the smell of expensive pine flooring and stale coffee, there was the faint, chemical sweetness of unburned diesel fumes. Arthur pulled his flashlight and stepped into the living room. The silence was absolute. The electric baseboard heaters were dead, their energy spent hours ago when the generator finally choked on its own exhaust. The beam of Arthur's light cut through the gloom, settling on the floor just 3 feet from the threshold. Thomas Gallagher lay face down on the woven rug, one hand outstretched toward the door handle he had never reached. His skin possessed the tragic, cherry-red flush that is the undeniable physiological signature of acute carbon monoxide poisoning. Arthur felt no satisfaction, only a hollow, terrifying awe at the brutal efficiency of the tragedy. He stepped over Thomas's body, walking slowly down the hallway to the master bedroom. Sylvia Gallagher was still in bed, tucked neatly beneath the heavy woolen blankets. Her eyes were closed, her expression remarkably peaceful. She had never even woken up. The odorless assassin had slipped into her bloodstream, turning her long sleep into a permanent one. Arthur lowered his flashlight. The absolute irony of the scene was a crushing weight. In his ruthless, paranoid bid to hoard the cabin's resources and ensure his own survival, Thomas had meticulously engineered a gas chamber. He had sealed the windows, locked the doors, and holed himself up with a machine that consumed the very air he needed to breathe. If Thomas had simply allowed Beatrice and Ruth to stay in the living room, Beatrice, with her knowledge of the cabin and the generator's exhaust risks, would have recognized the danger. She would have smelled the faint backdraft of the exhaust or felt the symptoms before it was too late. She would have opened a window. By violently exiling the two women into the freezing void, Thomas hadn't murdered them. He had inadvertently saved their lives, ensuring that he and his wife were the only ones trapped inside the airtight tomb. Arthur keyed the radio on his chest harness. "Dispatch. This is Henderson. I have the second victim secured. She is critical, but alive. Requesting that Talkeetna ground unit step on it." He paused, looking back down the hallway at the body of the man who had tried to play God on Blackwood Ridge. "And dispatch. You better send the state troopers and the coroner. We have 2 fatalities on site." The rhythmic, deafening thud of the HH-60 Pave Hawk helicopter blades shattered the fragile morning silence over the Matsu Valley, precisely 2 hours and 14 minutes after Arthur Henderson made his radio call. The military-grade medevac, finally cleared through the lifting atmospheric turbulence, touched down aggressively in Arthur's cleared pasture, blowing a blinding hurricane of loose powder and pulverized ice against the tree line. Beatrice and Ruth were immediately transferred onto the aircraft. Inside the vibrating, cavernous belly of the chopper, the environment shifted from a frozen wasteland to a frantic, highly synchronized trauma bay. Flight medic Sarah Jenkins shouted orders over the roar of the twin turboshaft engines, immediately hooking both women up to heated intravenous saline and high-flow oxygen. Arthur stood at the edge of the rotor wash, his heavy coat whipping violently around his knees, watching the heavy doors slide shut. He didn't wave. He simply gave a grim, singular nod to Beatrice, whose frostbitten, mottled face was barely visible through the thick plexiglass window. For Beatrice, the flight was an introduction to a new kind of agony. Freezing to death is notoriously described as a gentle slipping away, a euphoric numbing of the senses. Thawing, however, is an excruciating, violent biological resurrection. As the heated ambient air of the helicopter and the warm IV fluids began to incrementally raise her core temperature, the dormant, crystallized blood vessels in her extremities began to aggressively dilate. The phantom warmth she had felt in the cave was replaced by a searing, white-hot agony that felt as though her hands and feet had been plunged into a vat of boiling oil. She screamed, thrashing against the gurney straps until Medic Jenkins administered a heavy, merciful dose of fentanyl, plunging her into darkness. The recovery at Anchorage Providence Alaska Medical Center was not a matter of days, but of grueling, agonizing months. Frostbite is a cruel and patient creditor. It demands payment in flesh, and it waits to see exactly how much it can take. Dr. Aris Weber, the head of the vascular and burn unit, took charge of Beatrice's care. For 2 weeks, Beatrice was subjected to intensive hyperbaric oxygen therapy. She was sealed inside a pressurized, clear acrylic tube, breathing pure oxygen to force life-saving gas into the dying, microscopic capillaries of her fingers and toes. Despite the aggressive interventions, The line of demarcation, the harsh visual boundary between living pink tissue and dead, blackened necrotic flesh, eventually established itself. The surgical outcome was inevitable. On a bleak Tuesday morning in late February, vascular surgeons amputated the distal phalanges of 3 fingers on Beatrice's left hand and 2 toes on her right foot. Waking up in the recovery room, looking at the heavy white bandages swathing her shortened limbs, Beatrice realized these physical scars would forever map the desperate, freezing crawl she had made through the snow to save her mother. Ruth's physical survival, on the other hand, was deemed a localized medical miracle by Dr. Weber and his staff. Her frail, 68-year-old heart had somehow withstood the extreme thermal shock without triggering a lethal arrhythmia. However, the brain is far less resilient than the myocardium. The profound physical trauma, the terror of the forced march, and the extended period of cerebral hypoxia in the cave radically accelerated the creeping shadows of her Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Harrison Miller, her consulting neurologist from Seattle, confirmed what Beatrice already feared. When Ruth finally awoke in the intensive care unit, the slate of her recent memory had been wiped completely clean. The events of the blizzard, the violent betrayal by her son-in-law, and the dark, freezing terror of the limestone cave were gone. She remembered only the soft warmth of the hospital blankets, the institutional smell of the ward, and the face of her daughter holding her bandaged hand. Ruth had survived the nightmare, but Beatrice was left to carry the psychological weight of it entirely alone. While the Gallagher women fought for their lives in sterile hospital rooms, a very different, far grimmer procedural narrative was unfolding back on Blackwood Ridge. The legal and investigative aftermath swept through the property like a second bureaucratic storm. Detective Robert Finney of the Alaska State Troopers led a forensics team to dismantle the timeline of the Gallagher cabin. When Finney first breached the threshold of the home, the heavy, sweet, chemical stench of stale diesel exhaust still hung stubbornly in the air, despite the broken window. The scene they documented was a masterclass in tragic irony. The crime scene photographs captured Thomas and Sylvia Gallagher lying dead in a home that was 72 degrees. Their bodies flushed with the cherry-red skin tone that is the undeniable, physiological signature of acute carboxyhemoglobin saturation. The autopsy reports would later confirm that their blood carbon monoxide levels exceeded 72%, a uniformly and rapidly fatal concentration. Finney and his team mapped the utility room meticulously. They photographed the massive, commercial-grade portable diesel generator. They documented the 6-foot snowdrift that had solidly banked against the eastern elevation of the house, completely sealing the small ventilation window Thomas had cracked open. They found the stockpile of canned goods hoarded in the master bedroom untouched. The narrative was irrefutable, completely devoid of foul play on Beatrice's part. It was a closed-room tragedy built entirely by the victim's own hands, fueled by panic, greed, and a fatal misunderstanding of internal combustion physics. Because Thomas and Sylvia had died intestate with no surviving children, and because Thomas's aggressive threat to legally contest the property deed had never actually been filed in any Anchorage court before the storm hit, the legal machinations dissolved. The property rights to the homestead reverted seamlessly, indisputably, and permanently to Beatrice Gallagher. 6 months later, the violent brutality of the Alaskan winter felt like a distant, terrible fever dream. By mid-July, the summer sun baked the exposed granite of Blackwood Ridge, melting away the final, stubborn patches of snow hidden in the deepest ravines. The landscape was violently alive, a chaotic, unapologetic explosion of green ferns, fireweed, and towering spruce. Beatrice Gallagher stood on the heavy timber planks of her front porch. She held a steaming mug of black coffee, her scarred, abbreviated left hand gripping the ceramic with practiced, careful familiarization. The cabin behind her was different now. She had hired a local contracting crew to oversee the installation of a massive, heavily ventilated exterior shed for a new, state-of-the-art solar and battery array. The diesel generator had been hauled away to a scrapyard in Wasilla, its lethal presence permanently purged from her land. Behind her, the familiar whine of the screen door hinges broke the morning quiet. Ruth shuffled out onto the porch. She was wrapped in a light summer cardigan, despite the comfortable 60-degree morning air. Her eyes were bright, capturing the reflection of the sweeping, forested valley below. But they were largely vacant, entirely untethered from the brutal history of the ground she stood on. "It's a beautiful morning, David," Ruth said softly, addressing the empty air beside her daughter, placing a hand on the wooden railing. Beatrice felt the familiar, heavy ache in her chest, a grief that had evolved from sharp and agonizing to a dull, constant companion. But she didn't correct her mother. She rarely did anymore. There was a mercy in Ruth's unmoored reality, a protective barrier that kept the horrors of the ice at bay. Beatrice simply reached out, placing her own hand gently over her mother's thin, papery skin. "Yes, it is, Mom," Beatrice said, her voice steady, warm, and grounded in the present moment. "It's a beautiful morning. We're safe here. We're planting the Cherokee purple tomatoes today, just like you wanted." Beatrice looked past the edge of the manicured yard, her gaze drifting toward the hidden, jagged depression in the earth roughly 300 yards away, where the limestone cave sat silent, cool, and empty. They had lost pieces of themselves to the cold flesh, bone, and memory, but they had survived the absolute worst the earth and humanity could throw at them. The tragedy of Blackwood Ridge would eventually fade into local bush country legend, a story traded over campfires about the winter the vortex stopped the world. But for Beatrice, the lesson was etched into her very bones. Nature, for all its terrifying lethal power, is an indiscriminate force. It does not care about morality, greed, or vengeance. It simply exists. It was the calculated cruelty of human betrayal that had inadvertently engineered their miracle. By violently condemning Beatrice and Ruth to the freezing wilderness, Thomas Gallagher had forcibly removed them from the very gas chamber he had so meticulously built for himself. His fortress of paranoid comfort became a suffocating tomb of hubris, while the desolate, freezing earth had served as their brutal, unforgiving cradle of survival. The tragedy on Blackwood Ridge remains one of the most chilling survival cases in Alaskan history, not just for the extreme meteorological conditions, but for the profound psychological twists involved. Nature is an indiscriminate killer. It does not care about morality, greed, or vengeance. The temperature at 35 degrees below zero simply exists, a physical absolute that extinguishes life without prejudice. Yet, it was the calculated cruelty of human betrayal that inadvertently engineered a miracle. By condemning Beatrice and Ruth to the freezing wilderness, Thomas Gallagher removed them from the very trap he had built for himself. The fortress of comfort became a tomb of hubris, while the desolate, freezing earth became a cradle of survival. Beatrice Gallagher's story is a harrowing testament to the unbreakable bond of family and the extraordinary, terrifying irony of fate, proving that sometimes the coldest hearts are the ones that freeze first.